Well, welcome everybody. This is a sort of sad occasion because we lost our friend Chuck, and personally, I spent the last 20 years or so talking to him maybe weekly, and then I'm really gonna miss him. But I wanted to have this sort of. It only happened so recently, and it was on a Friday morning. Shyam, his last postdoc, was on the phone with him the day before. He was gonna go to the doctor to get some simple procedure done. I don't know whether you guys knew, he had like a age-related macular degeneration, so he was getting like monthly injections of VEGF inhibitor antibody. So, but it's like something, that he was doing every month. And then, he was gonna talk with Shyam again the next morning, and then he passed away, I guess, in the morning, unexpectedly on a Friday a couple of weeks ago.
So what was the cause of death?
We don't know, but yeah, so I don't know anything from the family that what happened, but it was unexpected. He had been in his office and talked to the secretary, just that week.
On Thursday, he was in his office,
yeah.
And I didn't see him, but Ramona did.
Yeah, Ramona.
Manager.
Yeah, and also Cindy was there and talked to him because he was hanging out there because his wife had gone to her medical appointment, so he was just hanging out at the Salk while she was at the medical appointment, and then then that's so. Anyway, so he has touched the life of many of us. He had this open door policy in his office. People could come in anytime and talk to him. As many of you know, he had a policy of having no lab meetings, so he talked to people individually. And he was one of a kind, the scientist. And I think we should, use this occasion, to share our remembrances of him. And then I'll let Rusty, who's the president of the Salk, put the Chuck's career in context and this event in context. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. So many of you knew Chuck personally, but I think some of you may not have known him historically or known him so well. So I thought I'd give a little bit of a history about Chuck. He did his undergraduate degree at Harvard, actually in psychology, and then went to medical school at Yale and realized he really wanted to do science and went to Rockefeller, where he actually did his PhD with Heartline. And he had a couple of faculty positions, one at University of Washington, and then he moved to Yale for fair amount of time, and in 1988 he became what we call here a non-resident fellow, and that's a group of illustrious scientists that sort of advise the Salk faculty on their promotions, tenure, advancement, and they really give a lot of advice to us individually as to how we should proceed. And that was 1988, and then 1990 we recruited him to the faculty. So he moved unusually, and we've never had that happen before, where somebody moves from a non-resident status to a faculty position. And then he and Steve teamed up and formed SNL. Well, it was a great time, and he and Steve really ran this whole organization, set the bar very high for everybody, and yet they were, as Gerald said, they had this sort of open door policy where you could just sort of wander in. And I moved here from UCSD in 1995 and had known Chuck before, but didn't have that intimate of a knowledge with him. And we would talk at least once a week, and I would, you've seen the courtyard up here. On the weekends, he and Jane would go up there, and they'd have a glass of wine and cheese, and often, there he is.
Two photos of Jane and Chuck having cheese
Yeah.
on the courtyard.
And oftentimes, you're not allowed to have red wine because they'll stain the travertine, but Chuck would always have a glass of red wine, so you don't drink white wine with this good cheese, he'd say. So, and you could venture up to them and have a chat with Jane as well, and so it was a great time for all of us that we spent with him. We were very fortunate to have had the opportunity to be with Chuck. He was, in addition, I don't know if some other people may know more about this, but he was also a visiting professor at the Aspen Institute, and he would go there every summer for I think something like 3 months. And he was for a short time, and he wrote books there and really had his physics fill when he would go to Aspen and come back in the fall, and he would tell us about the things that he'd learned and inspire us more at an individual level. Chuck was not a sort of group person, and so he wouldn't do well in a group like this, but he would take anybody on individually. Kent Schoenecker, our video guy, came up with a lot of these pictures. I'm looking because I haven't seen these in a while. That's a great red wine. So those are some of my thoughts about Chuck, and I would say we were a better institute by virtue of having had him here. He made us better, made us think harder about our projects, but also Chuck, as many of you know, had a great laugh and enjoyed using it. He liked to joke, and great sense of humor, and that cascaded through all of his heartfelt discussions about real problems. And I personally will miss him very much and thank him for all he did, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to now ask Terry to come up, who was close friends with Chuck as well.
Thank you, Liz. So it's with a heavy heart that I'm here today to tell you about Chuck was not just a great scientist, he was a great friend, personally, but also he was a great resource. Chuck was a creature of habit. You saw he would have every day, he and Jane would have lunch in the courtyard with red wine and cheese, and I think that he really cherished those moments. Now, not only was he a creature of habit with regard to his lunch, he was also a creature of habit with regard to tea time. So we have, in my lab at CNL, Computational Neurology Laboratory, we have a tea every day at 3:30 p.m. And some people like Reed Montague, who's in the audience, others in the audience for my lab, would attest to the fact that this was a great social occasion. And Chuck's office was right down the hallway. And so he would often come trotting down, and this was a wonderful event for the students because he was a fount of not just about science, but about the world and about what's going on with their problems that the students may have. They're doing some experiments and they're model, and Chuck would give them wonderful advice. Wonderful. And Tony Zador, who is here, put up your hand, Tony. I'll tell you, he was one of the early, when I arrived back in the 90s, Tony and Zach Mainin were kind of fixtures in the lab. Zach Mainin now was the director of the Champalimaud Neuroscience Institute over in Lisbon. And Tony is a high duke at Cold Spring Harbor. And for a long time, I thought Tony was a postdoc in my lab because he would spend so much time. But it turned out he was actually a postdoc with Chuck Stevens. And in fact, I have many papers, collaborative papers with Chuck Stevens that came from that era. And they were papers that were really path-breaking with Venki Murthy, for example, who's now at Harvard. We had a paper which showed that in tissue culture that the probability of release, the strength of the synapses, were very highly correlated along a dendrite, which is a very important observation. It was one of the earliest, and you know, but my favorite interaction in terms of science was when Tom Bartol, who's in the back with his beer. Okay, so Tom was doing some M-cell simulations of synaptic release from the presynaptic terminal. And we had made a prediction. Our model, by the way, it's a very detailed model that involves keeping track of the locations of individual ions, calcium ions, right? And where the ion channels are located and where the calcium is coming in. I mean, this is all done with the computers that now have gotten so powerful we can simulate very detailed, very complex molecular interactions. But at one point, we made a prediction. We made a prediction that if you had depleted, by stimulating, you depleted the vesicles, of readily releasable vesicles, that, we made a prediction for the time course of, being refilled and so forth. And in any case, so we went to Chuck and we said to him, what do you think? I mean, is this reasonable? And Chuck pulled out some data from his file. He said, well, I actually did those experiments. And it turns out that not only did the experiments, but they agreed with our model. And so we published a PNAS paper together. Isn't this true, Tom?
Yes. Chuck had this data in his filing cabinet, and it had never been published.
He had never published it. I mean, he does experiments, and he doesn't publish everything, This is really quite a... I think of him as a very kind of scientist, right? He's somebody who wants to know the answer. And okay, if I publish it, it's okay. If I don't, I just want the answer. That's very rare today, right? Very few people can afford that. Okay, so I think that I want to tell you one more story, and this is a little bit personal in terms of, I don't think he would have wanted you to know this. Okay, and this is very, very, it's a lesson. It's a lesson for everyone, for me and for you. When he was at Yale, Erwin Nair was a postdoc. And Erwin had his project was to record from single ion channels with patch recording. Now, patch recording didn't exist back then. And there are many technical problems with trying to record from a single ion channel. Just think about this, a single molecule in the membrane, and you're trying to record from that one molecule. I mean, even conceiving this as a problem itself took an enormous amount of foresight and scientific, focus. And so, Chuck helped support Erwin Nair in his attempt. And one of the problems is that, there's a lot of extracellular matrix and stuff and a gunk on the surface, and so how do you get a tight seal? And they didn't know how to do this. Okay, fast forward, it turns out you just suck you suck it, and it forms a tight seal. I mean, it was a miracle. But but in Chuck's lab, they didn't know this miracle. They didn't know how to do this, right? But they tried and tried and tried, and they actually made some progress. But they didn't get anything that was publishable. Erwin Nair goes back to Germany and hooks up with Bert Sakmann. Bert Sakmann is working on the neuromuscular junction. It's one of this is the acetylcholine receptor, nicotinic acetylcholine receptor is at that time, the premier channel. And it had a huge conductance, and if you can get this, you could get the Nobel Prize. Okay, and so they did it. But here's what Chuck told me. He gets a call from Erwin. Chuck, we've got it. It worked. Would you like to be a co-author? because, you know, it all started in your lab, and we want you to be a co-author. What would you say? He said, no, it's your project. You should take it and run with it. Wow. That was an incredible decision, and it really tells you a lot about Chuck, that he was in it, not for the Nobel Prize, he was in it for science. And that's the end of my story. So, okay, so Tony Movshan, who is on his way, would also like to tell, he's a non-resident fellow here at the Salk Institute. You probably know him because his work in vision, area MT. But before he comes, if there is anyone else that would like to tell us a story of your encounter, your experience with Chuck, I would welcome you to come up and tell us, if there's anyone here in the audience. Okay, Tom, come up.
I'll just augment.
No, you have to come up to the microphone because it's being video recorded.
Yeah, maybe we should have Shyam.
What? Okay, well, why don't you do the emceeing here?
So this will just be short to augment what Terry said about the data in the filing cabinet. So after Chuck pulled out this data out of the filing cabinet, and this was a project with Suhita Nadkarni, a postdoc in the lab, and she and I were working on this very detailed model of release of neurotransmitter from the presynaptic terminal with calcium influx through the voltage-gated calcium channels and binding to the snare complex to cause release of neurotransmitter probabilistically and all this. We had this prediction Terry told you about, and we went, and Suhita and I had been sitting with Chuck on many lunch occasions discussing the inner workings of the model that we were developing, and we felt very strongly that Chuck should be a co-author on this paper, and we made this prediction, and he pulled, and Chuck, resisted, wanting to be a co-author, and we just really wanted it because he had given us so much advice, right, on this. And we had already published a previous paper on a previous version of the model, and this was now 2 years later, and it was more sophisticated. We were making more powerful predictions, and he still didn't want to. He wasn't a co-author on that earlier paper because he just said, no, this is your project, just like Terry said. And then we made this prediction, and he pulls this data out of the filing cabinet, and it matches, the graph matches what our prediction said, and we redid our simulations to have the same, steps in dosage, and so that the points would line up at the same point, so that we could really put error bars on it and see how close it matched, and all this, and it was just beautiful. And Chuck still said, no, this is your project. But we finally just prevailed and said, Chuck, this is data out of, and this figure in the paper has that data in it. We can't just say, courtesy, Chuck Stevens.
You can't just say courtesy of Chuck Stevens.
Right. Right? You just can't do that. So we finally were able to prevail, and I'm really proud that I was able to publish a paper with Chuck and have his name as co-author on a paper that we've published together. And another part of my story is, I did my undergrad and work at Cornell University, and then my graduate school work at Cornell University with Miriam Saltpeter studying the neuromuscular junction. And in my PhD thesis, I've referenced Chuck Stevens many times, and he was this mythical figure who I never, hadn't met. And when I knew that he was at Yale, and then when I was came to Terry's lab as a postdoc, I come here and I'm attending one of the first seminars in the seminar room, which is right where our CNL lab is today. So back in the day, the entire south building, third floor, courtyard level was one giant open space. And you could stand at one end and look all the way to the other end with no labs at all in there. And there was this one enclosure, which was the seminar
It was
room.
circular enclosure,
And
and
it-
it's actually where our CNL is.
And if you look at the ceiling in the CNL, tea room, you'll look at the ceiling, you'll see this curved marking on the concrete ceiling, which is what's left over from that. Anyway, so I'm in the first seminar in there and attending this, and after the seminar was over, someone in the audience starts asking a question, and Terry says, "Oh, there's a question from Chuck Stevens." And I'm like, "He's here at the Salk Institute? Or is he just visiting, or what?" "No, he's a professor here. He's downstairs." I'm just this young postdoc who this like one week into my time here, and I didn't even know who all the faculty was here at the institute. I knew about Terry. I knew about Steve Heineman, because Mika, my PhD thesis advisor, Mika Salpeter and Steve Heineman were really close, studying the acetylcholine receptor. So I knew about Steve, and I'd actually been downstairs in that first week introducing myself to Steve, and I was here from Mika's lab and all this. But right, the next door over was Chuck Stevens' lab. I didn't even know. So, but right away, I introduced myself to Chuck, and he knew all about Mika, and he was happy that I was here. And we didn't really interact too much for a number of years until Sahita and I started working on this presynaptic terminal model that I told you about. But I can't tell you the change in direction in my research program and everything that he influenced. His ideas and his discoveries are just so seminal to the whole field, and I don't know where my research program would be today without having those interactions. And I don't know what else to say about it. So thank you. Thank you, Chuck. And they're not serving red wine out there. If they had, that's what I would have been having back there, not my beer. Anyway.
Okay, so maybe we should also have Shyam. Shyam is maybe, I don't know how many of you know Shyam. Shyam is like Chuck's last postdoc. So yeah, so I knew of Shyam before he even came here, because one day Chuck told me, "Oh, I have this really good computer science postdoc coming from Arthur Lander's lab at UCI," and he was really excited about that. This was basically sort of like the culmination of, in 2001, he decided he would retire, and retire basically means doing less committee work, and yeah, and then also, and there's the reason he wanted to retire, he told me, is so he could do more like physics-like theories for neuroscience. And that summer, in the spring, he gave the Kufler lectures at UCSD, one of the first ones, all three of them. And then he went in the summer to the Santa Fe Institute, where he was a non-resident faculty there. And then, just by himself, he published his first scaling law paper, which was a Nature paper as a sole author. And then a continuation of that is like that's how Shyam came into this. Anyway, so he probably like from all over. I think he's probably the last person who talked to Chuck, you know, and just the day before he passed away.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and then anyway, so Shyam has been with Chuck for a number of years now, and he probably can tell you much more about Chuck than I can.
All right. Hi, everyone. I wish we could meet under better circumstances, but it's good seeing some old faces like Anita and other people that Chuck talked about, but I'd never seen before. So I worked with Chuck for right now maybe about 10 years, and over that time we got to know each other. We worked on like 4 or 5 papers, so once you work on a paper together, then you have arguments sometimes, and you really get to know the person. And if you can stay friends after, that says even more. So over time, like our discussions turned more from science to like we would talk about all sorts of things. Like he would tell me like his experiences while he was an undergrad, for example. He told me the story once where he had a roommate when he was at Harvard, and the roommate didn't want to take the exam the next day. So what he did was he decided that he would contract a fever or cold, and so he went into the Boston winter, and he roamed around the whole night, and he came back, and he was perfectly fine. So he had to take the test. So, like, there were hundreds of stories like this, like from Chuck, and so I really got to know him. One of the things, so maybe I'll just share this one story, which I think is very emblematic or idiosyncratic about Chuck. So this was right after the pandemic, 2020, when the vaccines had come out. Chuck was 86, so he was like one of the first in line. He got the vaccine. Then he got the card, but the card, if you remember, the vaccine card is like this big, and Chuck didn't like that. He didn't like that. He thought the size wasn't right. He wanted it to be portable, like the credit card size that would go into his wallet. So he spent an entire week reducing the vaccine card to a credit card size thing. And next week when I came in, he had it laminated, and I said, "Chuck, how's it going?" And he's like, "I did it, here's the card." So it was that kind of also made me think about, it was one of his most endearing qualities, like there's this pandemic, people don't know how things are going to turn out, how we're going to, like, conferences are going to happen or not, but Chuck was always optimistic. Like even then he was thinking, okay, I'm going to be traveling again, and I need to have this portable vaccine card so that I can whip it out when they ask me at the airport. So that's one of my, in the last 2 years, it's one of my like happy memories about Chuck. And the other thing, just from a personal viewpoint, I spent a lot of time with Chuck, and I started wondering why we got along very well, and I was wondering why. And I think one of the things, there I tried to get, I didn't have a blue shirt, or blue sweatshirt. My objective was to dress just like him.
That's been consistent over the years.
Yeah. Actually, it was nice to see his pictures, because for the first time I saw Chuck in a non-blue sweatshirt. So one of the things I liked about Chuck, I realized, was that he had an extremely warm personality, and you felt like you could tell him anything and he wouldn't judge you. And I think that was one of the reasons that I was able to, like, open up to him and talk to him about lots of things. And in return, like, he told me lots of stories too. So that's that. I mean, I'll miss Chuck, but it's great to see all of you, and I think he'd be happy.
I think Tony Mosher, who's in the back there, would like to say something. Express interest.
Oh, Tony Motion has just
Yes.
arrived.
Yes.
I've been here all along.
Yeah, I have the disadvantage of not having heard what the people before me have said, so if I'm repetitive, then you'll forgive me. And I also apologize for being a little late. But Chuck was very special to me, as he was, I think, to probably everyone here. And I wanted to recall a little bit about why that was. Perhaps it began with my time as an undergraduate and his primer of neurophysiology, which was, in case any of you don't know it, a remarkable little book, which was, I think, is still the clearest and most elegant articulation of the principles that we use to understand how the brain works, and which was an inspiration at the time, even though I didn't know the man and had never met him or even heard him talk or anything. And then a few years later, when I was at NYU, I had the good fortune to get to know Chuck, first when he was at Yale and then subsequently here. I don't think I knew him when he was at UW. I actually was trying to recall on the way up, but I think it was at Yale that I first met him. And the thing that struck me then and throughout his life as I knew him was his extraordinary generosity of spirit. And that was a generosity both personal and intellectual. He had a remarkable range of interests. I'm interested in a lot of things, but Chuck was interested, as far as I could tell, in absolutely everything, including all of the things I was interested in. He also knew more than I did about all the things I was interested in, which was a little trying from time to time, but somehow he managed to make it not trying, and he was always able to bring a set of insights and a set of thoughts to a problem that you thought you understood in a way that I think was absolutely distinctive. I suspect that many of you have had that experience, but there really are very few people who have that skill. I've had the good fortune to know one or two or three, perhaps, such people in my life, and Chuck was maybe first among them. He was not only generous intellectually. I dragooned him into service as the chair of an advisory board when we formed the Center for Neuroscience at NYU, and worked him mercilessly for years. He also got stuck. The members of the advisory board when he joined were Rodolfo Linas, Emilio Bizzi, and Leonard Philipson, and so he was charged as the only native speaker of English to be on the board, to be the scribe as well as the principal advisor. But he was uncomplaining and always unfailingly generous and very thoughtful in the advice he gave. So for somebody who could understand, the deep principles of the organ that we all worked on, as well as understand how to manipulate and maneuver organizations like NYU, which is not the most limber and light touch place, was just a pleasure to watch. Now, I will not try and give an account of the things that Chuck did scientifically. I'm sure others have said, or others could better say, what he did, and his achievements are certainly beyond my ability to either enhance or diminish with anything I might choose to say. But the fact that he kept this range of interests, and he did eventually kind of get me back, because I think it was largely Chuck's influence or fault that made me a non-resident fellow at the Salk. So I've done a little bit of suffering in exchange, but somehow it seems like he did much more for me and for my institutions and my friends and my colleagues than I could ever do for him. But what I was able to do here is see what I think everybody here understands was the extraordinary influence he had in shaping the way this institution worked and still works. And even though he retired, I think his influence was undiminished. And it was institutions reflect the qualities of their aristocracy. And I am, although I'm as left-wing as the next person, I actually admire aristocracies when those aristocracies are earned. And Chuck earned his aristocratic status, and he set an example that I think all of us could and would want to follow. I certainly tried in a small way to think with a small fraction of the clarity and the generosity that he brought. And I'm not going to talk any longer because I suspect I'm repeating things that people have already said, but I guess I will just say that I was particularly saddened because I had been ready to see Chuck and Jane just before the pandemic fell on our heads. Didn't keep good contact with them during the pandemic, and I had reached out a week before he died to say, time to get together again, let's meet, because I was sure that he would have just as much wisdom to offer and as much friendship. So I will miss him no more, but maybe no less than any of you, and I wish he were with us.
Okay, so it's getting late, and we're all getting older. And some of you, I'm looking at Pashko, Yosef here. We need an exit strategy. We need an exit strategy. You're a scientist. You had a brilliant career, Pashko. You had a brilliant career, but what do you do for a second, for an encore? An encore. And Chuck showed me how to do that. Chuck had a fabulous physiology lab, state-of-the-art, LTP, tissue culture, kiss and run. I mean, all the fantastic, look, the first time I ever met Chuck was when I was a graduate student at Princeton in physics, and I went to a talk that Chuck gave in biology. And for the first time, I learned that synapses in the cerebral cortex were not like computers. They were probabilistic. That when the action potential arrives at the presynaptic terminal, that for some synapses, nothing came out. This was, for me, a revelation, because it means that brain is not a computer, right? This is a long time ago. This is like in the 70s, right? And that made a huge impression on me. And there are other things that a lot of things have had a big impact on the way I think about the brain. But let's also think about life, about his life, about the fact that he had these unrolling periods in his life. He was at Yale for many years. He once revealed to me that he got so much blowback from the administration. He wanted to go someplace like Salk, where he could actually do the science instead of having to deal with all the administration. And I think that's why he loved Salk. That's why he was here. It was because of the fact that we have we're blessed here at the Salk Institute, because science is number one. It's not teaching. It's not outreach. It's doing the science. And that's what Chuck was all about, right? And so that's why he ended up here. But he also taught me a lesson about aging gracefully. What do you do for an encore when you're Chuck Stevens? Computational neuroscience. No, I'm serious. I mean, he realized that, if I'm running this big lab with a lot of equipment and physiology and so forth, I can't continue doing that forever. And so 10 years ago, he said, okay, I'm going to close my lab, but I'm not going to close my scientific interests. And he became a computational neuroscientist. Wow. I mean, this is really amazing. And it wasn't a surprise to me because Tony Moshon mentioned he already wrote this book early on, a really precise, the whole book is like, 3/4 of an inch. But it's really distilled, and it's an insight into neurophysiology. And I have it in my lab. I have that book, and it was a distillate long before I knew him. Right, I had this book, and he always had he was quantitative. He understood equations. He spoke biophysics in a very deep way. And, he actually could have received the Nobel Prize with Erwin Mayer and Bert Sakmann for the fact that he was the first person using noise analysis to measure the conductance of a single ion channel by analyzing the noise. Brilliant. Brilliant. I mean, this is something that, was beyond what most of even the biophysicists back then could even imagine. Single channel conductance. He nailed it. He should have gotten a Nobel Prize for that. But, life is short. That wasn't his goal. Chuck was not after the Nobel Prize. A lot of people, you know them, right? They're not, well, okay, we all want to be recognized, but that's not the goal. The goal is to understand nature. I took a course at Woods Hole. It was my transition from being a physicist to being a neuroscientist. It was a neurobiology course, which was taught by Ed Kravitz. He was the director, but it was Harvard Neurobiology. And one of the things that I remember, it had a huge impression on me. But the Lilly, the big auditorium, has an inscription: "Study nature, not books." And Chuck studied nature. That was Chuck's primary drive. Now, his brilliance in terms of, I have to say, I was inspired by the way he made decisions about, his career and his life. And when he switched to computational neuroscience, I was first of all, what a fantastic switch, because he had all the chops for quantitative analysis of data. I mean, he was really, really good at it. And what he realized was that one of the primary questions you can ask about brains, all brains, the whole spectrum of brains, from the tiniest to the biggest, was scaling. How does nature scale brains? When you have a bigger brain, how do you vary the proportion of cells in the thalamus or the cortex or the supercolliculus, right? So that's what he did. He basically became an anatomist, counted cells. And this was, he published a whole series of papers which no one else had ever, thought about, because he had the key insight, the computational insight, that scaling was an important principle in biology. And it turns out to be an important principle, not just in biology, but in computer science. And all the great advances that have occurred in artificial intelligence have been all about scaling, all about going from larger and larger networks, and as they get bigger, they have more and more capabilities, especially with the large language models that are coming online. He understood that. And so how do you apply that to your own life? Think about it. Okay, you know, you have careers, and there are people out there who are beginning their careers. There are people who are, you know, mid-career and so forth. And I'm looking at Jeff Goodhill in the back, who was here at the Salk Institute as part of our Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience. And you know, he was for many years in Queensland, but he's now at WashU in St. Louis, and I have to say that, you know, he's an example of someone who came through the Salk and was influenced by all of the research that was done, not just the research, but the people who were here, like Chuck Stevens. We are a community. That's how science is done. Science is a community effort, and it's the interactions between scientists that advances the field. It's not the genius. It's not the person, you know, who has the great idea. No, that's not how science works, at least not in my experience. It's people like Chuck. It's people like Chuck who basically are the people in science who help the community by, you know, their students that they've had. You know, you heard from Tom Bartol, right? I mean, this is like, you know, he helped everybody that he ever met. Everybody has a story about Chuck Stevens. Now, so I want to end by saying that, unfortunately, his advice about, you know, how you change your career, unfortunately, doesn't work with me, because he switched from neurophysiology to computational neuroscience. And what am I going to switch to? You know, Sidney Brenner, who was also, he was a senior fellow in the Crick Jacobs Center for Computational and Theoretical Neuroscience, once gave me some advice. He said, Terry, never retire until you have the next job lined up. I'm still looking for that job, but nonetheless, things are going well. Okay, so Gerald, do you want to finish up? Because we're getting late here.
Yeah, so anyway, so if anybody else wants to say anything. Yeah.
Oh, Tanya.
Okay, I would like to share maybe 3 short stories. The first story is from Chuck Stevens, as he was an undergraduate student, and there was a language requirement. And he said, how about a Pascal? That's a language too, right? So for some reason he didn't want to take standard languages. And the second story is that whenever Chuck wanted to learn something, he would write a textbook. And in his office, I think there are still textbooks on advanced theoretical physics. So every time he went, and they're all teched up and available. So that
we should be able to find a couple other ones, because I know he started a few. So at a certain moment, he wrote an R manual. When he just started learning R, he wrote an R manual. He wrote.
Gerald, they can't hear you on the video.
So Chuck also wrote an R manual. He wrote one. He talked a lot to Dennis O'Leary at a certain point. He was like, he also wrote a developmental biology one. The small physiology book in the 1960s was a manual that he wrote for himself also. And that 6 core theories of modern physics or something like that, that was also something that he wrote himself because he kept forgetting it. So he basically wrote that as a book for himself, as a manual. And I think there are a couple other recent ones that they're half started, half finished, but I think they're still around. And if Shiab can get hold of them, then it's like, I mean, there are there is much. Yeah, there's like a lot of treasure. Like there's a very recent one on the history of random projections, and there's a and there's a developmental neuroscience one also. So we should if people are interested, we should actually collect these and distribute them among the interested. So if people are in agreement, we should actually curate these and cherish them.
Okay. And then I would like to conclude with a quote that I often come back to from Chuck Stevens, and he said to me once, "Answers are easy, questions are hard." And that's how to come up with a question that has an interesting answer before you know the answer. So that's what I keep thinking about when thinking about him. Thank you.
So, hello everybody. I just wanted to give a contribution from graduate student and maybe early career students, early career scientists. So I asked Chuck Stevens to, I usually chat with Chuck during the tea time, and it's my pleasure that he loved my CNL tea time. I'm a PhD student at Teresinovsky Lab. So once I asked Chuck Stevens to give me an advice, and he told me, Mohammed, for past 50 years, I have worked on 5 different fields. Every 10 years, I changed my field. If you want to become something, don't change your field. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I don't know if anybody here is from the University of Washington days. I don't know if anybody here is from the University of Washington days, but Chuck told me a story that when he was at University of Washington, he bought a VAX computer, and then the VAX computer that he bought, one of the things that he did with it is basically he looked at the statistical properties of words and then word frequencies at any given distance, so like the frequency of one word to the next one, and then he wrote a whole bunch of poetry on the VAX, and then submitted to the local radio station, and the local radio station apparently really liked it, and they actually kept reading this and then attributing to this poet called Chuck Stevens, who was actually the VAX.
So that reminds me of Howard Hughes Medical Institute story. So Howard Hughes is a very, as you well know, a very elite institution, and I was an investigator for decades, and so was Chuck. And there was a period when Max Cowan was the scientific director, and we all know Max. I mean, he's a wonderful person, but he hated computers. And there was a period when, if you were an investigator, I mean, this is going back, early days when Chuck was an investigator, when if you asked for a computer, and they were very expensive. We were talking about, DEC computers and VAXes and so forth. They were very expensive. And if you asked for that, it would just be cut off, right? Because Max, and there's another sub story I'm not going to tell you about Salk, but he was our scientific director for some time, before my time. But in any case, Chuck figured out how to get around this. And this is pure Chuck. What he did was, he didn't buy a computer, he bought the parts for the computer and assembled them in his lab. And it got through the radar. And, it's really the essence of Chuck, is that he understands more deeply than the administrators, than others, in terms of how to get something done. Now, I think all of you have been touched by him, right? Put up your hand if you've been touched by Chuck Stevens. Okay. And that's why we're here. And we're trying here to try to be, not just celebrating him, but also trying to learn from him. His life was exemplary, and in a life in science, very, very few of us can achieve. He did it. And it's 9 p.m., and this is when Cinderella leaves the hall. But I want to thank you all for coming and for helping us remember Chuck. Do you want to say the last few words?
Well,
Come on.
Yeah. One last thing is Chuck joked a lot about death in the last few years, and one of the things that he said, in this way that and that he went, it was the best way to go. So in the end, this is probably the best way for him to go. Although we miss him, it's this in a way was what he kind of wanted. So anyway, thank you all for coming.